We've now talked about perception, how information comes into the system, then about attention and how some of the information is selected for processing and other information is filtered out. Now we're really getting to sort of more higher level elaborate cognitive functions, and the first one we will talk about is memory. Now, memory is of course completely critical for functioning successfully in the world, and that goes anywhere from knowing where to go, remembering things for uh, tests in school, to your personal narrative and remembering your own life stories. So, memory is, in that sense, a vast term that really encompasses several different aspects, and we'll talk about these different aspects. So, some of the central questions when we think about memory is how do we get to remember stuff? How do we store and then remember information? So, in other words, how do we get stuff into memory? Then, if we need to hold on to information for a brief time, so for example, when somebody gives you a phone number, how do we hold on to that information and manage to actually process it until we no longer need it? Just like when a waiter goes to a table and takes an order, how do they keep that in memory for a short amount of time? Then, if we have information stored in memory, how do we pull it out at a later time? So when you're studying for a test, right, the idea is that there the studying is going to help you with retrieving that information when you're then actually being tested on it. So how does that work? How does that work for different modalities? How is it for visual information? How is it for auditory information? How is it for facts? How is it for different skills that you may have and so forth? And then what is the influence of context as well? Sometimes you may remember something very easily when you're in a particular context, and if you're in another context, you somehow can't. Or, when you walk into your childhood home, all of a sudden these memories are coming back to you, and in other contexts they wouldn't. So these are some of the guiding questions that we'll touch on in this larger module of memory. Now, when we think about memory, we can ask questions about the architecture, or we can ask questions about the processes. So one question is, how is memory organized? What is the structure of the memory system? Is it like a bookcase where different kinds of knowledge we have goes on different shelves? And then when we are asked certain questions about certain topics, we kind of, in our brain go to that shelf? Or is it more like interacting neurons that get wired, and if they fire together, they get stronger connections, and if they don't fire together, they get weaker connections? So those are questions about architecture. There's also a lot of questions that we can ask that are just about processes. And in some ways, these are more functionally oriented. So, for example, how can I study better in order to remember better? That's about the process of remembering. How can I prepare myself that when I'm at the test, I'm better able to pull stuff out? So that's about retrieving information. How do I get it into the memory system? That's about encoding information. And these processes are all critical for a functional or well-functioning memory system. So we'll talk about some processes as well. Now let's start with a really influential model of memory that's very simple, and still it's older, but it's still pretty influential, and it's helpful to think about memory in the context of this model. So here's what happens. It's a couple of boxes, and these boxes recognize that information happens at different kinds of time spans. That sounds very fancy. What I mean by that is that some information we only need for the short term. Like when you hear a phone number and need to put it on your phone, you want to hold on to that number for a short amount of time, put it in the phone, and then you don't need to remember it anymore. You just need to remember where you can find it. So that's short term. Now, of course, we also have long-term memories where, if you become a psychologist, you actually want to have some long-term knowledge of the topic of psychology and be able to pull that out as you need to. So that's more about long-term memory. This model recognizes that there's sort of memory that's of the really, really short duration, so that it comes into our senses and it briefly lingers there. And unless you do something with that information, it just drops and gets replaced by new information. So that's in our sensory stores. If we then pay attention to it, it moves on to more of a short-term store where we can actually do a bunch of processing on it. And then if you really want to remember it, there's processes like rehearsal which transfer that short-term information into a more longer-term store. So if you look at the timeline of these different stores, as I said, sensory stores, very short durations, short-term memory or STM stores, a little bit longer durations. And the key thing about that type of system is that it has very limited capacity, and we'll see why that is and what the evidence is for that. And storage is fragile. And then there's this long-term memory system that sometimes people liken to, a hard drive in a computer. And we'll see if that's correct or not. But the idea is that there, in principle, you have almost unlimited capacity. You can keep putting stuff in, and it holds information over long durations. So let's start with looking at these short-term stores, these sensory stores for a second first, because those come in different forms. So first of all, it's been hypothesized or proposed that there's a visual sensory store, so for visual information, and an auditory sensory store that deals with sounds, with auditory information, and sound also meaning language. So how do these stores work? Well, the visual store is almost like you're processing icons for very brief amounts of times. It decays within about a half a second, and then it's replaced with new information. And what does this do? Well, it helps us with visual perception to operate on these icons rather than a full representation of the visual environment. And then it's sort of enough to orient attention to where it needs to go. And as soon as we do that, it gets refreshed. So we can actually shift our attention within this iconic memory in about 55 milliseconds. So very, very fast operating system. And it gets constantly replaced by new information. That's the visual store. Now the auditory store is a little bit slower, has a duration of about 2 to 4 seconds. And the easiest way to think about this is just, again, if you are given a phone number by somebody, you kind of briefly loop that there. And then if you don't start working with that information, with the numbers, it will disappear and be replaced by new information. If you, however, do start paying attention, then you can actually use it for further processing. As soon as you decide, or quote unquote, your attentional system picks up information in the visual sensory store and or the auditory sensory store, it then goes on to short-term memory. And short-term memory is a little bit longer duration, obviously. What we do in short-term memory is that we use information that is currently activated. That means information that's coming from the sensory stores that we've decided to keep active, so the phone number you're repeating. It could also mean information that you've temporarily activated from long-term memory. So for example, if I ask you, hey, what's your name? Long-term memory obviously has your name stored, but as you're being asked that question, you're activating that knowledge from long-term memory and briefly putting it in short-term memory so that you can actually answer the question. And as soon as you've answered the question, the activation in short-term memory will decay, it will just drop off, and it will still be in long-term memory, but it will not be active in short-term memory. So for short-term memory to successfully get us by in a lot of tasks, this has to be operating pretty effortlessly, and it has to be pretty immediate. As I already said, activation decays, meaning it just fades away, unless you continue to use the information. So you can prevent decay by repeating the same information while you're working with it, but as soon as you stop doing that, unless you write it on a note or something like that, it will just disappear. So this gives you a first sense of a couple of things. So first of all, 3 different systems, sensory stores with really short durations, so half a second for visual information, 2 seconds for auditory information, and then the short-term memory store. I'll say more about the capacity for that in the next video. And then there's long-term memory. And then I've laid out how these differ.